I'm Beth Stroll with the TA Network for Children's Behavioral Health, and I'd like to welcome you to this month's System of Care Leadership Learning Community Meeting. Thank you so much for joining us. I know many of you were challenged by snow today, but the show must go on regardless, and we're happy to be able to present the learning community for you this afternoon. The topic today is using social marketing for system change. And to give you a little bit of an orientation to the learning community, Denise Silsbeck and I co-facilitate this community, and we hold it monthly, and it's designed to support system of care leaders in states and communities, tribes, and territories, those with and without system of care grants. We address topics that are important to you, and we welcome your suggestions on future topics, so please reach out to us if you have any ideas. We would like these sessions to be as interactive as possible, so we encourage you to put your questions and comments and insights in the chat box throughout the learning community session. We've also incorporated time for questions and answers, and we'll make sure that any questions you enter in the chat box are addressed. I'd like to draw your attention to the box just below the chat, and you can see that you can download today's PowerPoint presentation and some other resources, and also as a follow-up, you'll receive a link to the recording of this webinar. And at the end of the session, a link will pop up for a very brief evaluation survey. We would appreciate very much if you could take just a few minutes to complete this and provide us with your feedback. Before we get started, I'd like to also mention that our next learning community meeting is April 18th, 2:30 to 4 Eastern Time. The focus for that one will be considerations for serving young children and their families in systems of care. It will be led by one of the TA Network's early childhood experts and will feature examples from 2 systems of care that are focused on young children. They'll highlight specific strategies that you can use to expand your system of care efforts to serve this population, and we hope you'll put this on your calendar and plan to join us then. Again, today's topic is using social marketing for systems change, and we're very fortunate to have a group of outstanding presenters. Carolyn Fearing and Jane Tobler are social marketing TA providers. They are with the very skilled team from the Caring for Every Child's Mental Health campaign. Then we have very strong examples of how social marketing has been used intentionally to achieve system of care goals. And to share those are Brandon Alexander, who's the Marketing and Communication Specialist from Alliance Behavioral Healthcare in North Carolina. Kim Hall is the Project Director of the Beaver County System of Care in Pennsylvania. Maureen Hawk, who is the Coordinator of Youth Services at the Beaver County Rehabilitation Center in Pennsylvania. We then have Jackie Chapman, who is the System of Care Project Director for the Mississippi Department of Health, and Lauren Bodwee, who's the Social Marketing and Communications Consultant for the Broward County System of Care in Florida. So now I'll turn this over to Carolyn, who will get us started.
Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you everyone for being here today. It's really nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces from systems of care around the country. Our learning objectives today are to learn more about the social marketing approach and the steps of the social marketing planning process. We hope after today's webinar you'll understand more about how social marketing can be leveraged to contribute to systems change, and it's a really great complement to systems change work. And then, as Beth said, you're going to learn and see some real examples of how social marketing has supported systems change in various systems of care around the country.
So this is Jane Tobler, and I want to also share my welcome with everyone. One of the things we want to start with is, what is social marketing? So people hear a lot about different things on social marketing, and it really is the marketing of behavior change that benefits society as well as the audience. And no, really, that's it. As you can see, the slide says, it's not a raising awareness for the sake of raising awareness. It's really about changing attitudes and beliefs that can have an impact on behavior, how we think, feel, and act. So for social marketing, the center is the audience. It's always about, you always have to think about your audience, and there has to be a benefit to the audience. And today we'll hear from several system of care communities and how they thought about their audience, what they thought about their audience, how they made sure that what they were doing was helping to make the behavior change with their audience. But you have to understand the audience first. You have to understand what is influencing your audience already, what do they care about, what are their wants and needs, and what are they willing to exchange in order for the behavior change. So one example I think about is when my parents were younger, they really didn't wear seatbelts very often. And then information came out about how if you're in an accident, you're more likely to be safer if you wear seatbelts. So growing up, we all had to wear our seatbelts. And for them, the behavior change was they modified their behavior to wear the seatbelt because, one, they influenced us to wear our seatbelts, but also, two, they knew that safety was part of it. And now, of course, seatbelts it's the law. So again, people have modified their behavior change, whether it's because they want to be safer, because they want to be a good influence for others, or because they want to avoid paying the fine. But it really is just about changing the behavior to which benefits society as well as the audience. So
yeah, and I want to just add one thing, which is for those of you who may be new to social marketing and new to our webinars, you may have come into this thinking social marketing is Facebook and Twitter and all of those great social media platforms. So obviously this is not that social media marketing, and social marketing has been around since the 70s and 80s is when it really took off. So it's been around a while, way before we had even internet. So we do use social media in our social marketing sometimes, not always. We don't need to use it, but I just wanted to kind of clear up that confusion in case anyone is completely new to what we are talking about as social marketing.
That's a very good point, Carolyn. Is there, do you want to share another myth you've heard about social marketing?
Yes, I do, Jane. I have heard, actually, you know what, we have a question here before we go into those myths. I don't know if we want to just pull that up before we go into our the other myths that we have heard from communities. So let's see what those are.
So the question is, how much experience do you have with social marketing? So everybody on the line, some of you are doing it. If you want to take a moment and just vote and let us know, that would be great.
Yeah, and then actually, Tiara, could we hold off on that second poll until we've talked about our myths? So let's do our first poll here about how much experience you have, and then let's wait on that second poll. So it looks as if most people have some experience or a good amount of experience, and far fewer people have a lot or no experience. So everyone is kind of in the middle or at the beginning of learning about social marketing. So Tiara, if we could just close the poll for a second, and then we'll come back to that second poll in just a minute. Thank you. So let's wait for the slides to populate one more time. So here's one that I've heard a lot, Jane, which is that social marketing is something separate from the work we do on a day-to-day basis. It's only to reach families and youth, and it's all about raising awareness, and it's about making sure that families and youth know that our system of care exists and how they can get help and how they can get services and supports. And so there are two parts to that, one of which we've already talked about, which social marketing is not just about raising awareness. It's about behavior change. And so, of course, the first step in changing people's behavior is often raising awareness. But sometimes people are already aware of what's going on. You know, for the example of smoking, for instance, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who doesn't know smoking is bad for you, but there are still people who smoke. So it's not a question of awareness. So you have to think a little bit differently about what's stopping them from doing that behavior, and we'll talk more about that later in the webinar. So that's the first piece. And then the second piece is social marketing is a great tool to integrate into all of the work you are doing around systems change. So not just to reach families and youth, but also to reach key influencers, community leaders, and kind of influencing the systems change that you're trying to bring about through the system of care work. So Jane, what social marketing myths have you heard?
I like when people talk about, think it's social marketing, it's all about media outreach. It's about media outreach, advertising, and social media. And you mentioned earlier, although Facebook and Twitter can be good channels to reach people, it's more than that. So media outreach is a tool in your social marketing toolkit, and it can be very effective to help in your social marketing outreach, especially some key decision makers. It doesn't always have to involve media outreach. You could have an event, you could have a meeting, you could have something like that that isn't necessarily something you need to advertise or promote via social media or an ad. It could be, you know, we're having a meeting with key stakeholders to talk about what we're trying to do and what our goal is, what they care about, and how we can move that forward. So Carolyn, you have one more to share?
I have one more, yes, which is it's big campaigns, it's flashy campaigns, it's slogans, it's something that makes a big splash. And while that may be true, that may make sense in your community, you know, most of us don't have the budget to do, you know, kind of the big media campaigns that we may see on a national level. And oftentimes that doesn't make sense. You don't need a giant budget to be good at social marketing, and sometimes you're actually going to be much more effective if you are really targeting a very specific group of influential people rather than doing a big broad sweep. So not always about the big flashy campaigns, no. And Jane, you have one more?
Yeah, if we tell people what to do, and that they'll just do it. You know, we know what's best for them, and they'll just do it. And that's social marketing. We're like the puppet masters, and we're not. It really is more than that. And behavior change is very complicated. It's very, you know, it's very complicated. There are a lot of pieces. We already talked a little bit about the goal and audience and channels and messages. And I know later, in a few minutes, we'll talk more about the specific parts of the social marketing process. But it really is, you know, it's changing the way people think, feel, and act, and looking at the audience as centric. And I know one of the things for systems of care that, as I've been involved with it over the years, have changed is, you know, even the idea of family-driven and youth-guided. You know, there was a time in, and in some communities this is still the case, where we don't think that, you know, they're not as necessary to the plan. And we know that that isn't the case. We do need them, you know, front and center. It is important that we are creating the great systems we have based on them as the center of it.
All right. Thanks so much, Jane. So I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I think I may have totally messed up the poll. So I think we're going to skip the poll and move on. But what we wanted to talk about next is just to kind of reinforce by talking about how we use social marketing for systems change. Of course, the end goal is that we want to increase the number of families and children and youth who are getting the help that they need. In order to do that, though, oftentimes we have to do a lot of behind-the-scenes work, and that's the work you're doing every day around systems change. We have to change people's attitudes. We have to create buy-in sometimes before we can even kind of implement some of the work that we do with youth and families, and you'll see a great example of that when Beaver County talks about the work that they do in schools. So, in order to get to that systems change that makes in order to get to the, getting families and youth into services, we need that kind of systems change to make that sustainable. And I think it's also really important to think about, people don't live in a vacuum, they live in an environment, and we have to think about, why families and youth might not be reaching out and getting the help that they need. Maybe the system is working against them, which is, of course, the day-to-day work that we do. And just to give you kind of another example from a different field, one that I worked in for many years, which is obesity prevention, childhood obesity prevention, the initial attempts around that were really about reaching families and youth and quote-unquote, educating them about healthy food and health and active living. And so what people realized was, well, we're telling people to do this, but they're living in environments where they can't access healthy food and they don't have safe options for exercising. So we need to change the environment. We need to change the system so that they can do that, so that they can eat more healthily. And that's really what you're doing with systems of care. So make sure that social marketing is a complement to your systems change work. Don't set it aside as advertising to families and youth that your services are available, but can be used as a complement to everything that you're doing.
Thanks, Carolyn. And finally, social marketing sustains. Sustainability strategies that benefit from social marketing include cultivating strong interagency relationships, which I'm sure you can all relate to, involving stakeholders, establishing a strong family organization, and using evaluation results. And this is all in the System of Care Handbook by Beth Struhl, who you may remember from the beginning of this webinar, and Gary Blau. And there is a lot of evidence on the importance of social marketing as a sustainability tool and as contributing to systems change. So it is important, and it definitely helps sustain. We know that from the results. So Carolyn, you want to give us a quick highlight on how we do it?
Yeah, and so I'm not going to talk about this too much because everyone who's going to present after me is really going to illustrate this planning process that you're seeing here, which is the social marketing planning process. So it's not particularly complicated. It's a great way of making sure that your marketing efforts are effective. And usually what happens is we tend to start social marketing halfway around the wheel, where you see activities, events, and materials. And so we rush to create brochures or we rush to create materials, but we can be so much more effective if we are thinking about all the steps that come before that, which is what is our goal, who are we trying to reach, who is our audience, what are messages that are going to resonate with that audience based on what we know about them, because we need to spend a lot of time thinking about our audience and putting ourselves in our audience's shoes and thinking about, well, why are they not doing the behavior that we want them to do? What would motivate them to do that behavior? And then, basing the messages that we use in our materials on that audience analysis. And then also pre-testing our materials, showing our materials to our audience members to make sure that they make sense, that the messages resonate with them, and changing things as we go along, because none of this should be set in stone. It's a dynamic world, and so our social marketing should be dynamic and change along with what's happening. So as Beth mentioned earlier, we have a document available for download, which is a workbook on the social marketing planning process, which goes into a lot more detail on this. It's available for download, but case studies that you're about to hear from will really show you how this plays out. And so the first of those is from Mississippi, from the Crossover XPAND System of Care, and I would love to introduce Jackie Chapman, who is going to talk about the work that they did to encourage trauma-informed practices across systems in Mississippi. Thanks, Jackie.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for having us. We're very proud to discuss what we're doing in Mississippi regarding encouraging trauma-informed practices across our systems in Mississippi. So just a little information about us. We recently received our third System of Care grant in 2017. We had previous grant projects, MTOP and Project XPAND. Our MTOP grant was the system of care that started the infusion sites, or the concept that other system of care sites in Mississippi now have modeled. Our current crossover grant is target audience is 3 to 21 in Jones, Forest, Marion, and Lauderdale counties. So when we first started looking at what the training needs and topics were for our partners, and this is in starting back really in 2012, we knew that our youth were involved in overlapping systems. So it was important for us to coordinate our training efforts to help meet the needs of our youth and families. So one of the things that we did was to disseminate a training and technical assistant needs assessment to provide to our partners at the state level, our families and youth, and previous conference attendance that included representation from our partners, including juvenile justice, education, and law enforcement. We wanted to find out what topics were important to our partners that they wanted to learn more about, and what needs they had in their communities, again, regarding training and technical assistance. From that assessment, it showed that people wanted to know more about training on trauma-informed care and how do they implement it in their communities. Our goal was to encourage trauma-informed practices among adults who support youth and young adults with mental health concerns. And I just want to note in that picture, we have our family involvement coordinator on the left-hand side, Marsha Moody, and Kizzy Kidd, who was one of our parent caregiver peer support, and myself. I'll discuss a little bit later how important it was to have those individuals who had trauma in their families or themselves, and that when we did our trainings, that we always make sure that we included someone that had that experience, because it made a greater impact. So who were the people that we wanted to partner with as we move forward in following through with our social marketing goal, and included leaders and other staff in the following child serving agencies: the education, again, juvenile justice, child welfare, our family groups, and also those who were providing services from the behavioral health pinpoint, and that included also health department and vocational rehab. So what is it that we wanted to see or wanted them to do? The behavior change was to learn to identify trauma and incorporate that understanding of trauma into how we provided services and supports to our youth and their families. To encourage that behavior change, we had to consider what our audiences knew about trauma and trauma-informed care. We also had to consider their attitudes or thoughts on the approach so that we can communicate the benefits of adopting trauma-informed care. We also needed to communicate that many people were already serving those individuals who had experienced trauma, and how that trauma significantly impact their behavior and their mental health. We also needed to educate our audience about the trauma-informed approach and how it will lead to better outcomes. So when we spoke with our audience, we found that people were concerned about, will it cost more? Will it add more work to what we're already doing? And then really discuss that trauma-informed care lead to better outcomes at home, at school, and in the community. And on this slide, you will see some of those barriers, but also the benefits. And the benefits were what we focus on more. The benefits outweighed what the barriers were when talking to our audience. So what were the compelling messages that we wanted for our audience? And this is just some of them. Talking about adverse childhood experience and how that impact child development and can have long-term consequences. That trauma exposure can increase the risk of a range of other vulnerabilities. And then perceiving what is trauma, how it varies from person to person. And if you look at the picture on the slide, this is just one example we use when we talk about trauma being individualized. And we ask the question, what do you see on this picture? Some people see two faces each other, and then some see a vase. So again, we talk about how trauma is individualized. Other messages include trauma-informed care, again, will lead better outcomes. That research says from 55 to 90% of the people that we provide service to have experienced at least one traumatic event. And that was powerful because, again, when we discussed with our audience, we talked about that. Look, you're already seeing these individuals in your agency. So how can we make sure that we provide trauma-informed care for better outcomes? So what was the ways or the channels for us to reach our audience? And this is through listserv, media outreach, training, the training attendees themselves, youth and families who benefit from trauma-informed care, our peer providers, which was, again, very important when they shared their personal stories, and then Twitter and Facebook. One of the things with the listserv that we did, as people came to our trainings or conferences, we kept all of those email addresses and other information. We also asked our target audience to give us a list of people who may have attended their conferences or a list of their stakeholders involved in their prospective system. And from that, we end up getting a listserv about, really over 5,000 people. So that was good. Each time we even presented or had a workshop, we made sure that we sent information out to those individuals. One of the main ways that we reached our audience was through training and speaking engagement, and this included also annual staff training, employee orientation, to make sure, again, that we were getting the word out. We looked at different agencies as far as what they were doing. We gave them strategies for responding in a trauma-informed care. We also had evaluations that we did, and they were basically on the pre- and post-knowledge of the learning objective. On that evaluation, we also asked for, again, email and contact information if that agency or if the staff person wanted additional information about trauma-informed care. This picture is of our 2017 annual Trauma-Informed Care Conference. At the conference, we had over 550 participants. Again, just spreading the words through the listserv or through our stakeholders in our audience. We presented different versions of our trainings depending on each audience. We tailored the messages to fit their needs, whether they involved, again, in education, juvenile justice, or child welfare. On the screen are just examples of our audience or our different audience where we presented trauma-informed care, again, on what their specific need was. So buy-in. Buy-in, I cannot really stress the importance of buy-in. For us, one of our lessons learned was in some of our earlier trainings, we didn't have those decision makers or upper management involved, or they didn't attend for whatever reason. And we had to go back with the messages again, talking about the benefits of trauma-informed care. But one of the things, again, is that once we went into an agency and was providing the training and we saw the executive director up in management, you know, that was a whole nother different feeling because we knew that they were obligated and were willing to give time and dedication from their staff to be in that learning environment regarding trauma-informed care. And if we did a good job, then they always ask us to come back and do more. So again, the buy-in from upper management, those decision makers are very important. When we looked at our outcomes, we also presented that to the audience, especially in those decision makers, of some of the outcomes if they were involved in becoming trauma-informed. And these are some of the outcomes from our training, that there was a wider recognition of the prevalence of trauma, its effects, and practices that were potentially traumatizing or re-traumatizing for our youth and families. We looked at also increasing ability to describe trauma-informed care and appropriate treatments and interventions for those who have experienced trauma. And also the increase of trauma during our intake screenings. And on the screen is just the example of that screening that was included in all of our intakes for our 14 providers or our community mental health centers that make up the 82 counties in our state. As they open up new cases, that trauma history was a mandatory form that they had to complete. Other outcomes included reducing the use of potential harmful practice like seclusion and restraints. We also look at the use of PRN medication, develop new partnerships, and also increase ability to identify those treatment strategies that were consistent with trauma-informed care, and strategies, again, to look at the reduce the likelihood of re-traumatization.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I really loved how you spent time, like you mentioned in the beginning, to really get to know your audience, talk to them and understand them, and that you were highlighting the benefits in those messages that you developed, and that you developed very specific, tailored messages for them, and that you addressed some of the barriers that you identified. And one that we hear a lot is I don't know how to. So, it's one thing to ask people to be trauma-informed, but if they don't have the skills to do it, then of course it's very difficult for them to be effective at that. So by providing these trainings, you addressed a huge barrier, and then in order to bring those trainings about, developed very, as I said, very tailored, effective messages to get the buy-in of upper management who could have that impact on staff, and then also use great tactics. Again, going back to, it's not always a big campaign, but using a lot of word of mouth, figuring out who was already on board and using influencers to reach people who might not be on board yet. So, some really great social marketing tactics to bring about systems change, and to have, to end up with screening question on your intake form about trauma is a huge achievement, and a very clear, policy change that was influenced by using social marketing effectively. So thank you so much for sharing that with us, Jackie. Jane is going to introduce our next presenter.
Excellent. Thanks, Carolyn. So Brandon Alexander is the Marketing and Communications Specialist at Alliance Behavioral Healthcare North Carolina. He was also very involved in becoming DURHAM in North Carolina, and he is going to present When Compassion Calls, Working with Law Enforcement to Divert Treatment. So welcome to the call, Brandon.
Thank you, Jane, and good afternoon, everyone from North Carolina, where we did actually had a little bit of snow ourselves here this morning, but now it is all gone. So once again, I just want to thank you for having me on. Again, we love talking about one of the things that we were able to do at our system of care here in North Carolina. So just a little quick background about us. I was the social marketing coordinator at the time for the Becoming grant here in Durham, Durham County. It was a 6-year grant. We were funded in 2010, and we graduated community in 2016. Our focus was on transition age youth, the 16 to 21-year-old population here in Durham. And if you are not aware, Durham is part of the Research Triangle Park, which encompasses a big section of here in central North Carolina, and that includes Raleigh and Chapel Hill. And one of the things that Durham is most famous for, it is home to Duke University and the Durham Bulls baseball team, which if you've ever seen the movie Bull Durham, that is what makes that team so particularly famous. So Becoming wanted to help law enforcement officers recognize when a youth or a young adult they encounter is experiencing a mental health crisis, and then how to divert that youth when appropriate to a crisis facility or to us so that they can be connected to services rather than jail or emergency rooms. So they get a lot of calls for that. We were looking ways to kind of to help divert our youth from those other facilities to a crisis facility or to us. So in the picture here is former Durham Police Chief Jose Lopez. I'm glad he's on here. He is a former police chief. However, without his support, a lot of what we accomplished during our 6 years would not have been possible. So when we were looking at our data and deciding why we wanted to tackle this problem with our law enforcement, we simply had to look at the numbers we had. So in the year leading up to our grant, which was 2009, there were 444 youth in Durham County, 1621 on probation, 1,703 were arrested for a total of about 3,800 incarcerations. So just looking at that, we knew we had to do something. So our goal was simply to strengthen our relationship with the law enforcement to support the young people we serve. So fortunately, our system of care had been around for quite a few years and had a relationship with the police department, but we were wanting to strengthen that even more to help this particular age group. So when looking at our audience, as Carolyn and Jane and Jackie mentioned earlier, it is so crucial to think about who your audience really is and how reaching them will help you get that behavior change you intend. So by focusing on the primary audience, and in our case it was leadership in law enforcement and law enforcement officers, by focusing on that primary audience, at least initially, you won't waste a lot of valuable time on some secondary audiences who might not have as much influence in getting that behavior change. So speaking about behavior change, as I mentioned earlier, we wanted to have law enforcement officers, when appropriate, to refer individuals, our young people, to treatment. And that treatment could be whatever it looked like for that individual, instead of the alternative of jail or the emergency rooms. So once again, as I know Jackie mentioned, I can't say enough about understanding your audiences. So when looking at that, what are some of the barriers to this behavior change, and how did we show the benefit to those audiences? So the first thing we discovered there was a low awareness of how to address the needs of youth with mental health disorders. Along with that, we need to talk about and figure out how to change how officers feel about youth and young adult with mental health disorders. So I don't think some of the barriers you see here are just specific to law enforcement personnel. It can be said about many of our other community partners. It's the whole stigma around those with mental health challenges, and then the lack of skills necessary to help those in a crisis situation. So, quite a few of us have taken the American Red Cross first aid training, but how many of us really have taken the time to do a mental health first aid training to have some skills to help those in a crisis situation? So, like I said, looking at those barriers, I don't think that is specific to just law enforcement. I think it's specific to a lot of community people and partners. And so those barriers are still the same reason why our system of care communities that we have here at Alliance are such big supporters of mental health first aid. So when you're looking at your audience, you also have to think about the benefits. How are you going to, quote unquote, sell them on this? So one, we'll have safer interactions with young people. And then if youth and younger adults are getting the services that they need, then law enforcement are spending less time on calls to that same address. They're not wasting time going and answering the same calls to the same household when they could be going and tackling something else that is, another situation on the other side of town. So showing the benefits to your audience is key in getting that behavior change. So what did we do? So our system of care worked with our law enforcement partners to develop a youth and even a cultural and linguistic competency module within the Crisis Intervention Team curriculum. So if you're not aware, Crisis Intervention Team is designed to teach officers and other emergency personnel the signs and symptoms of a mental health crisis and then the proper ways to work with those individuals. So in the youth model that we created, we had the ability to share with officers a direct connection to one of their peers. So this was probably one of the most unique things at Becoming that I feel like we were able to do. So what that looked like is if an officer had a call and recognized that the young person that they encountered might fit the Becoming criteria that they learned about in the youth module of crisis intervention, they were able to flag that in their system, in their police system. I'm not sure exactly what that was called, but that system would then alert our officer that was 100% dedicated to us. So Becoming had an officer with the Durham Police Department that was 100% dedicated to us. That officer would get notified, and him and a care coordinator would then go out to visit the young person, see what was happening with them, talk to their family, and enroll them in Becoming directly on the spot. So that could happen within hours. If it was overnight, it happened the next day. So I will say, that the officer also, when people think of an officer arriving at a young person's house, kind of what that kind of may look like. He arrived in plain clothing, in an unmarked car, and so, we think this direct connection to a peer for officers was extremely valuable in that aspect of our training. And pictured here, you see a recent graduating class of CIT officers and some emergency personnel as well in Durham. So, the messaging. How can we partner together to help those experiencing mental health crisis out of the criminal justice system? And then once again, you're looking at how to describe those benefits to your audiences. And you see some of those benefits here and how it can improve safety outcomes for officers and decrease consumer injury rates as well. As, again, about the messaging is how do we partner together to keep those experiencing a mental health crisis out of our criminal justice system, as well as using messaging to describe those benefits to those target audiences. So I want to say when looking at messaging, there's not one way that's going to be the same for every audience. Every audience reacts differently to messaging, which is why it's so key to understanding your audience. So that goes back to that earlier slide and back to the earlier presentations about that. You see here some of the methods we do. Some of them you may recognize, but sometimes, just good old conversation is just as fancy as a slick or fancy brochure that we may have created. We did some email marketing. We did outreach events. So we were at a event that had officers and other personnel there. We described kind of what we did and why it was so important to take a look at this. And the Durham Police Department was so excited about this partnership that we had created that they wanted to highlight it. So we created a video about our relationship with mental health and police work. And then they even presented the video as well as our the modules that we created at a CIT conference one year.
As soon as that word pops up, bipolar, schizophrenic, you already know that this isn't going to be the average call. Arresting them is not going to cure their bipolar disorder. They obviously need some help. And arresting them is not the solution, obviously, from my training and experience with these subjects.
A lot of folks that we deal with, they've never had guidance. None, zero. They have no guidance whatsoever. So they only do what they know. So I mean, if you keep on them and you provide them with the guidance, hey, you need to go. I think it would probably benefit you if you were either NCCRI, Durham Access, Durham Center. You need to get moving. Do you need a ride?
Strengthen and collaborative relationships with mental health practitioners and service providers are essential.
We have spent years cultivating this relationship and this understanding of the common purpose between criminal justice and mental health. We have way too many people with mental health issues in our jails, way too many people calling 911 to ask for assistance that never get into treatment. And so if you continue just to treat the crime, you're never treating the problem. Mental health is relevant to police work, and not all places see the relevance of mental health in police work. People just don't wake up one day and decide to commit a crime.
So finally, most importantly, what are the outcomes? So the biggest outcome that I will say is the sustainability piece of those modules. So even though our grant is now 2 years removed, both those pieces, the youth module as well as our cultural and linguistic competency module, still remain in place. And so then we've had, as you see here, some of the other stats, more than 200 officers with CIT or 40 hours or more. So it is a 40-hour training that they have to take. It's all done in 1 week. So it's kind of showing the effort of these officers who are participating on their part. We saw a youth. A significant number of youth being referred to crisis rather than the jail or emergency rooms, which is exactly what we're looking for. And then you see some of the ones that accessed mental health services through referrals from law enforcement. So we were able to track that through this officer in our care coordination where they came from. So we were able to see that 288 got that access services from our law enforcement personnel.
That's awesome, Brandon. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing that with us today. And I especially appreciate, when you talk about that, your goal, which was a little more self-evident because you realized the goal was really to have better collaboration with your law enforcement agencies. And we know that a lot of system of care communities are looking to have better relationships, and how do they do that? So that was very helpful. And I also like that, you really dug into the barriers and benefits and talked about how, just reduction in recidivism, less time in court, like what were the things that your audience cared about, and developing the crisis intervention training, which has made such a big difference. I also really appreciated that in your channels you talk about having a good old conversation, because that's exactly right, that, sometimes it's not a matter of coming up with something amazing and different. It could just be what's the best way to reach them. And, having, various channels, including just talking to them formally and informally. So that's really helpful. And I think that people will definitely go check out your video, and your outcomes really speak for themselves, which are really strong. So thank you so much. And now Carolyn will introduce our next speaker.
Yes, our next speaker is two next speakers are from Beaver County, Behavioral Health in Pennsylvania, also dealing with snow today. Kimberly Hall and Maureen Hawk are going to talk about work that they have done within their education system to empower youth. Kim and Maureen, go ahead.
Thank you, Carolyn. My name is Kim Hall. I am the project director for Helping BC Scores, a SAMHSA System of Care expansion grant that was funded in 2014. Just a little snapshot of Beaver County. We are located in southwestern Pennsylvania between Pittsburgh and the Ohio state line. And the population of Beaver County is almost 170,000. Though we are small, we have 15 separate school districts. And the county is served by the Beaver Valley Intermediate Unit, which acts as a liaison between the school districts and the Pennsylvania Department of Education. The IU has a transition council that provides a mechanism for the education system and the transition age youth providers to better serve the population in the county.
Hi, my name is Maureen Hawk, and I work for Beaver County Rehabilitation Center, and I am one of the coordinators of the Youth Ambassador Program here through the grant. First, we did an assessment of need. In our county in 2016, we experienced several suicides that impacted multiple districts, and the teachers and students didn't know how to help those in need, even though they were very much wanting to. There was a crisis team available, but it wasn't promoted very much, and many people were unaware of it. The school administrators sometimes were hesitant to speak about suicide and mental health, and what we noticed was there was a lot of discrimination and stigma associated with talking about mental health and mental illness. We actually asked the youth what they needed from us, and they said that they wanted to help their friends and be able to let them know where to get help, but they didn't know how to approach the conversation and didn't know what services were actually available to them in the county. One thing I wanted to point out is that my job through BCRC is to coordinate a school-to-work transition program for youth that are 14 to 21 in the county. So I was able to already be involved with multiple school districts and interact with several youth. So that's how a lot of this came to our attention, because we were actually able to hear the youth voice and with some of the kids that we were already working with, as well as some of our own children. One example is that my daughter was in one of the school districts where one of the suicides occurred, and she had come to me several weeks after the incident and said, you know what, Mom, it's like this kid just didn't exist in our school district. And her and her friends were so upset. It had happened right before school started in 2016, and she said, you know, they got us together in the auditorium, they told us all what happened, they made services available to us like the first couple days, and then everything went away. It wasn't made a big deal, and it didn't seem like the school district in particular identified that as being a symptom of a larger problem, and that really upset a lot of the students. So that's what really got them motivated and interested in trying to make a difference.
So we realized that we really needed to make some changes and better reach the transition age youth and the schools. In order to do this, though, we needed to start small. Through the grant, we identified 5 school districts that we worked closely with. 3 of them were districts that we lived in and our children attended, and 2 were districts that we were providing the vocational supports to and had good working relationships with. We saw this as an opportunity to work with the education system and to educate them about our system of care. Working with education to change the system was really a large task, though. We had to break it down into a smaller and more manageable process. So we looked at our overall goal, which was to increase mental health awareness and decrease discrimination or stigma. But we were really looking at reaching several audiences with the messaging. First, we needed to reach the youth. Then we needed to reach the teachers and school staff so that they were on board with the students and able to support them. But for everything to really work and take hold in the districts, we needed to reach the people at the top, the school district administration.
So we started by learning about our audience and identifying some of the barriers that we were going to encounter in starting this process. We realized, as Kim had said, that we really had a diverse audience that we were addressing. And a lot of the contacts that myself and my other colleagues had through our department was from the ground staff. So we started at the bottom, and we knew we needed to get the buy-in, and that buy-in would come not until we got to the top with the the principals and the assistant principals and superintendents and things like that. So what we did is we started meeting with each school district with the key people that we were already involved with, and then asked them to bring others to the table that we knew needed to be involved in order to affect systems change. We had to get that buy-in from the school district so we could educate them. We knew there was a lack of knowledge about mental health services and resources. We knew there was an existing fear about talking about suicide. We knew that they just didn't know about what services were available in the community. So we had a big job ahead of us, and we had to make sure that we started and got everybody on board within each school district so they would be on board with us and move forward. So then we looked at some of the benefits. We were able to see outcomes and small changes pretty quickly with the 5 school districts that we started with. The students got energized very quickly and more wanted to be involved. We started with about 8 to 10 students per school district, and pretty soon we had other students that wanted to become involved as well. Teachers from those 5 school districts talked to other teachers, and they wanted to be involved because they were identifying the same issues in their school district as those original 5. So when we had our first event in September of 2016, we had those 5 districts on board. By the time we had our second event in January of 2017, we had 10 districts on board. And by May, we had all 15 school districts on board. There was such a need and a rush to become a part of this movement that it just kind of drove itself after a while because of the energy among the students and the teachers. So what we were seeing as benefits is that the teachers and the students would become educated and know what services were available and how to connect students who were in need of services. The students would be able to access resources and support their peers. What we found when we talked to the students was that the first person they were comfortable talking about a problem with is one of their friends. So we made sure that we wanted to educate the students at the ground level in order to be able to have them be comfortable talking about those kinds of subjects and making referrals to whoever those key personnel were in each school district. We also wanted to make sure that the teachers were better able to understand their students. We realized that there's only a few special ed teachers in each school district, and the majority of teachers didn't have a background in mental health, and we needed to give them as much information and arm them and equip them as much as possible. We hope to see that the students would receive better care and be healthier. The big thing was obviously the acceptance of mental health challenges and the reduction of discrimination and stigma within the district. And that is one thing we have been able to see and we have been able to measure through some of the surveys that we've done. And the largest thing is hopefully a systems change. We charge these young people to be change agents and explain to them how important their voice was, and that if they started a little ripple, pretty soon that you were going to see a wave. And that's what we've been able to see now over a year and a half later in Beaver County. We're starting to see systems change.
So again, we had several audiences that we were targeting, so our messages needed to be broad. We wanted to educate everyone about the resources and services available through the system of care and how to access those services, but we also needed to educate the school administrators and let them know that talking about suicide and mental health doesn't make the problem worse, but addressing mental health issues can actually prevent problems and promote wellness.
So then some of the channels that we used, we talked about meeting with the teachers and the key personnel in the school district. We used our already established connections and then just broadened those. And we were not afraid to meet with anybody we needed to meet with. We knocked on the doors and said this is what we wanted to do. So we had several meetings in some cases. We went to school board meetings, presented to the board and administration, and we did whatever we needed to do within each school district. We had to realize that each school district had its own culture and needs in the community, so we had to adapt our approach to what that culture of acceptance would be and just go in there and meet the needs of that individual district. And the commonality that we did see were that the youth and adults really didn't know how to deal with all of the grief and frustration they were experiencing after these tragedies, and it was very overwhelming for them. And we wanted to make sure that we were comforting and telling them that, you know, we are here to help, and, you know, there are resources to assist you. You don't have to feel alone, and we can help you help your students.
So we are using many different ways to reach people. We have a System of Care website with resources and current announcements, and a System of Care Facebook page. We have a college intern that's helped to create Twitter and Instagram accounts to reach the youth using hashtags that the youth have created at the events. She's been able to link these accounts to the Facebook page and the website. And one of the things that we learned from the youth was that Facebook is lame and only old people use it. So in knowing that, we were able to put the same information on the Facebook and websites that the older people and family members and providers would be able to access, so they can access the same information just through a different social media account. We also use something called the Remind app, which is an app created for teachers and coaches to reach their students. We use it to send messages to the youth ambassadors and also send out surveys about speakers for the events, food for the events, and other questions we might have about giveaways or something. The youth ambassadors also created videos with the help of one of our providers, Presley Ridge. How has mental health affected you? What advice would you give a friend who needed help? And how has the Youth Ambassador Program helped you? These videos have been shown in the schools and are also available on the System of Care website. The 5 original school districts also designed posters. You'll see the 2 original posters at the top of this slide. And a graphic artist then used the original designs to create the final posters. The schools are putting the posters in the nurses' offices and bathroom stalls, which is where the students told us that the posters should go, someplace more private, that people could look at them and get the information when other people weren't watching. And the posters have become so popular that providers are now asking for them and hanging them in their waiting rooms and offices. And on the far right, you'll see the T-shirts. So some of the posters have been turned into T-shirt designs that the school districts are going to use to help raise funds for their individual youth ambassador programs.
So in order to get the youth educated and energized and mobilized, we've had multiple activities and events throughout the last year and a half. We've had three trainings the first year, and we've had 2 so far this year. And this is a chance where all of the districts are able to get their representatives together. We have a day-long activity where they are getting information about various topics of mental health, whether it be stress and anxiety, bipolar disorder, issues surrounding LGBTQ. They've also asked us to incorporate not only the educational part, but activities that they could learn about on how to deal with stress. So we created something called a stress-free zone, where we've brought in different activities that involve physical activities such as yoga and Zumba and boxing. We have therapy dogs at all of the events, which they just love. We've done several different art projects and motivational projects. We've had a maze where it's like a meditating maze. One of the other things that we've done is something called Yap After Dark, and this was a way to kind of take it to the next step, where a school district would then host an event and try to spread the word and spread the awareness to the rest of their student body, their parents and families and guardians, and the rest of the community. And then we had a lot of the school districts participate in the Youth Mental Health Awareness Day, where they were able to, again, use the knowledge that they learned at these trainings and spread that throughout the school district. But we couldn't have done all of this without having the buy-in of the school personnel. We needed them to allow us to promote the events, to have space in the school when we had activities at the school, or to give the students permission to attend the trainings, which were at a centralized location in the county. And these were all activities and events where, like I said, the youth and their sponsors and all of the system of care providers came together. It was a nice, safe learning environment. The school leadership also attended a lot of our events. So it was real important, like I said, again, with the buy-in, that we had those key people there. And what we did see as a result of it is a competitive spirit that kind of helped build and grow the awareness and the participation in the YAP activities. And they actually started having a little bit of a rivalry where they were challenging each other to see how many students could get involved in the different clubs at the school. So we really liked that. And then we had a lot of media involvement. Our activities were covered by the local paper on the front page above the fold. We were proud to say we also had a local TV station do a program on the youth ambassadors at one of the local school districts, and we've also been on the radio talking about the whole system of care and the youth ambassadors. So that was wonderful to help support our cause and help create more awareness. And then here's some of the outcomes. 4 of the 5 districts that originally were a part of the first group participated in the Youth Mental Health Awareness Day. And like I said, we started working with 5 and we've expanded to 15. What we've been trying to do now is to contact, we want to make sure everybody is involved. So we've contacted the parochial schools, the special education public schools, alternative education schools, cyber charter schools, and things like that, because we want to make sure all the youth in the county has a voice. And what we've seen is more schools are open to talking about mental health. We've seen increased referrals to different services, in particular our help team, which is staffed through our Presley Ridge provider. And we've seen teachers are connecting the students with appropriate services, whether it be out of school or school-based mental health services too. And then what we're seeing now as the next phase, as the Youth Ambassador Program is now becoming a club in some of the school districts. So the hope is to have them, again, be more involved, the whole thing be youth-driven, and they are reaching out to their friends. And what we saw, we originally had about 60 kids with those first 5 school districts, and we are now up to over 200 students and growing that attend the larger events. And we hope to continue to see this growth as we finish out our 4th year of our grant. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Kimberly and Maureen. That was excellent. And our final presenter is Lauren Beaudouis, and she's going to talk about understanding your audience, how to creatively engage key stakeholders. Lauren?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me today on this webinar. So just to tell you a little bit about our site, we're located in Broward County, Florida. It's South Florida. And we have a 5-year grant that started in 2014. It was initially awarded as a planning grant, and then we were awarded the 4-year grant for implementation. So our system of care serves youth primarily. We have services primarily for youth 18 to 21, but we've been able to engage the other youth serving and child serving agencies with some prevention work in order to help young people 14 and up. So our county is really diverse. We have a really diverse county. 32% of our residents are foreign-born, and it's an urban city, Fort Lauderdale being the largest city in the county. So looking at our goal and audiences, in the beginning, when we were first developing our social marketing plan, the intent was to how do we inform other stakeholders in the community families, and also young people. So as our presenters were talking about earlier about creating buy-in, we wanted to find a way how to keep our key audiences engaged. So we came up with a newsletter. And what's really interesting about the newsletter, it's a very versatile platform, right? So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it already, where you're able to include the videos, links for other services, and also just emphasize what we were discussing earlier, that social marketing doesn't have to be about big budgets. So what's really interesting about the newsletter as well is that it's free. You just need someone to manage it, and you also need to talk to people to get some interesting content in order for people to want to subscribe and read your newsletter. So moving on to the next slide. So initially when we started, we wanted to, we asked ourselves, how do we engage the community with the system of care values and principle? How do we inform them about the grant that was just newly awarded in Broward County? So our content was mainly focusing on the system of care principles. We talked about what is OCP2. We gave out information about our different meetings, the different committees we had, and other information that was relevant for stakeholders. But in the second year, so we realized, as we talked about, the social marketing plan is not something that is stagnant. It can change over time. So in conversation with stakeholders, young people, families, we saw that in the second year, we might have to change up our content. So at this point, we really started focusing on how to promote the youth-run and family-run organization that we had in our system of care. And also, at that time, we were able to compile, and we had enough data from the evaluation team that we were able to capture and design some infographics and creating that content that would engage our audiences, meaning stakeholders, providers, and staff. And our county is really broad, and anyone who's familiar with Florida knows that traffic is impossible. So a lot of people sometimes may or may not make it to meetings. So it's a great way for us to be able to share with other people who may not attend those meetings, those trainings, and things like that, because it's something that once it's online, and you can share it with other people. It's also with this platform, and we use MailChimp. There are many others out there, but you can archive your editions, and that is something that stays online and that other people can access later on. So these are, I'm just going through the slides just to show you, this is one edition that we had. It was a workshop that we did with young people, and we reported about it to our audiences. We included pictures. This one has pictures, but a lot of times we're able to add videos as well. And how do we develop our distribution list that has grown over time is mainly, I'm sorry, I'm reading one of the comments from the participants. So mainly it's email that we collect through different trainings that we have, different providers and their staff. So a lot of times at meetings we only have supervisors and clinicians and some family members, but how do we reach other people? So this has helped us reach other staff and other people that would be interested in learning more about the system of care. So what else? I think this is it for my slide.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Now you can see something funny that we just put in, which basically is we want everyone to take the key takeaway that the importance here is buy-in for system of care change, and behavior change. And that's buy-in of the families and youth that you're working with, buy-in with the leadership for systems change. And we know it's not easy to push the boulder up the hill, and that's what social marketing sometimes feels like. But the more you ensure you meet the needs of your audiences in the beginning, the lesser chance that that boulder is going to come back down the hill and flatten you. That's not what we want. We know we're changing the world, and sometimes those boulders get heavy. So next slide, please. Okay, the slides are going to catch up. I'll just keep going. So one of the slides has the social marketing TA providers listed. If you're a funded system of care, you have access to the social marketing TA providers. And that's also, the next slide is just a resource of all the wonderful social marketing TA resources there are available, and that is available to anyone. And I think we're going to open it up to questions.
Yes, thank you all. There are a few questions that were put in the chat box, and we have a few minutes left to address them. The first question, actually, I'd like to address to Lauren, is that given the current events in Broward County, how has the system of care, and in particular your communication efforts, responded to what's been going on and supported the community in responding to that?
Well, we work closely with other partners, child serving and youth serving agencies in the community. And together we have joined efforts to make more resources about trauma accessible to the community.
Okay. There were a couple of questions for Jackie. One, how did your consortium choose the audiences? For example, education, juvenile justice, etc.
Okay, it was several things. One, that we were fortunate to already have a previous system of care before MTOP, where some of those relationships were already built with the partners. And the other thing, as I mentioned, that we know that our youth were involved in other systems, and those systems were those audience, again, that we've reached out to. So again, one, because of our previous relationships through our previous system of care, and then by working with them youth and finding out what other systems they were involved in. So that's how the audience was chosen. The audience was chosen.
Okay, and there's a follow-up question from Kristen as well, and I'm losing that here.
Beth, I think the was and this could really apply to everyone who presented, which is how did you identify, basically how did you learn about your audience? How did you learn what the barriers were, what the benefits were, and how did you understand them more?
Thank you.
So, I mean, everyone could weigh in on that if we have time. I think that's a really important question, because that's really the key to social marketing, is putting yourself in your audience's shoes. We live and breathe this work every day, so we see it from kind of an internal perspective, and what we think of as being a benefit or as being a barrier may not be the case for the people that we're trying to reach. So it is really key to understand your audience and learn more about them. So it would be great if our presenters could talk a little bit about how they put themselves in their audience's shoes.
I'll start off.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Brandon. Some of the barriers were identified from the audience itself. When we first start talking about trauma-informed care, some of the things that they mentioned, is this going to cost me some money because our budget is funny? Or, look, we are already overloaded. We don't have anything on our plate or any additional room on our plate to start something new. Or, will it be extra work for us? So that was some of the barriers that were identified from the audience. And then the other barriers were just noted from the trainings. On the evaluations, when we asked for, what was the least effective thing in this training, or what was most effective, and then people will say, well, it was the numbers. I didn't realize what the prevalence was for trauma and people that we're already serving. So it was, again, from our trainings, and then barriers that are identified by the primary audience.
Yeah, this is Maureen. What Brandon started to say, and I probably am just going to echo what he was going to say, is there was a lot of listening, less talking, more listening. We had ideas when we met with the students, and we ran them by them, and they're the ones that said, no, that's not going to work. This is what will work instead. Same with the school districts. How do we get in here? What personnel would be appropriate to lead the YAP group in your school district? Here's who we were thinking, and they would tell us, oh no, that person's so overloaded, but this student or this teacher really connects with the students, and we think this person would be great to be your liaison with the students. So it was a lot of listening and a lot less talking. They needed to tell us what their needs were and how we could help address them.
Any other questions, please do put that in the chat. Brandon did put his answer in. He was saying that we learned about our audience and the barriers by just talking with them, learning about their needs and their concerns, and used it to develop strategies. Let me just mention that I'd like to thank all of the presenters for their outstanding work on this session and the very rich information they shared. We had some great examples and some very concrete practical strategies that you can apply in your own states and communities on using social marketing and communications to achieve your goals. I do also want to thank Tiara Brown from the TA Network for handling all of the technical aspects of this session and doing it so well as always, and especially today where the challenges of doing this remotely and given the weather challenges, it's been obviously a difficult process. I do want to say that either whether or not we can share this video, the link that will pop up when we finish to the evaluation, we take your feedback very seriously, and we want to use it to improve our learning community. So stick around just for a couple of extra minutes to do that. I do want to remind you again that the next learning community is April 18th on serving young children and their families. And it looks like it's a no-go with the video. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Apologize for the video. We did send you the link. Hopefully you'll be able to watch that on your own. We'll resend that link along with the link to the recording to this webinar so that you can refer to it later. You will receive that in a follow-up email. So everybody, thank you again for joining. Stay warm, go build a snowman, and we will look forward to having you on the learning community next month. Thank you to all our presenters, and again to our tech team. Survey link should be coming up.